June 4, 1943, Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. A German soldier presses his face against a train window and something inside him breaks. Not a weapon, not a surrender, not a battlefield defeat. He sees lights, and nothing will ever be the same. 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps had just stepped off a passenger train in Texas, not as conquerors, as prisoners. What they were about to witness over the next 2 years in the farms and factories and living rooms of an America they had been trained to despise would demolish everything they had ever believed, more thoroughly than any bomb, more completely than any defeat on any battlefield. This is the story of the most successful re-education program in human history. No torture, no propaganda, no coercion. Just breakfast, electricity, and the quiet. While overwhelming evidence of what a free society could build witnessed by its enemies and carried home to reshape a broken world. Stay with us, because the deeper we go, the stranger and more extraordinary it becomes. May 13, 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. In a single afternoon, approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their weapons. Among them, the veterans of Rommel's legendary Africa Corps, men who had driven the British back to the gates of Egypt, men who had earned the grudging respect of Field Marshal Montgomery himself, the greatest desert army in history, gone in an afternoon. Among the prisoners was Unteroffizier Erich Hartmann, our central figure, a composite drawn from the most detailed POW diaries and intelligence reports of the period. 23 years old. Former machinist from Stuttgart. Not 3 years of war had burned the softness out of him, but 3 years of Nazi ideology had also built something inside him, a certainty about the world, about Germany, about America. That certainty was about to be destroyed, piece by piece, not in battle, but in a Pullman coach. Nazi propaganda had prepared German soldiers for this moment with a careful, confident script. America was a mongrel nation, racially mixed, politically divided, controlled by Jewish financiers, incapable of sustained military production or genuine courage. The American soldier was soft. The American economy was a paper tiger. Germany had nothing to fear. Erich Hartmann believed this. So did nearly every man around him. It was not an opinion. It was simply the truth, the world as it was. The first crack appeared before the ships even left Africa. At the processing camp in Oran, American efficiency was already beginning to fracture German preconceptions. Thousands of prisoners were processed daily. With an organizational precision the Wehrmacht had never matched even at the height of its power. Identity cards photographed and filed. Medical examinations completed. Inoculations administered. Geneva Convention rights explained. In fluent German by American officers who had been trained specifically for this task. And then the food arrived. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later as follows. In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration. Their standard military ration, not a performance, not a photograph for the Red Cross, just breakfast. By the summer of 1943, Liberty ships were arriving in American ports at a rate of 3 per day. The same vessels that had delivered war supplies to Europe now returning, carrying 20,000 to 30,000 German prisoners per month. America was using its excess capacity to import an ideological crisis. It just didn't know it yet. The 2-week Atlantic crossing provided the second phase of what American intelligence officers would later call psychological demolition. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a meticulous account that survived in letters to his family after repatriation. His entry for the third day at sea is one of the most quietly devastating documents of the entire war. The ship's crew disposed of more food waste each day than my entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. The American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long. They did this openly, without thought, not to mock us, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. Limitless. That word lodged itself in the German military mind like a splinter. They had been trained to think in scarcity, to ration, to conserve, to calculate. The Americans threw food away because there was simply more where that came from. The first sight of America destroyed the last remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. August 2nd, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. Norfolk Naval Base sprawled across 4,300 acres. Its docks stretched for miles. Cranes loaded and unloaded dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading from the deck of his transport. He wrote in his diary, "Each crane lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the cold smoke that choked our industrial cities." And then I saw the parking lots. Hundreds of automobiles, not officers' cars, not party officials' cars, but the personal vehicles of dock workers, ordinary men who drove themselves to work. In Germany, the Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, had reached fewer than 1,000 civilian households. Here, longshoremen drove to their shifts. And then came the trains. The prisoners had expected the 40 on 8. The battered boxcars stamped 40 homes ou 8 chevaux that had carried Soviet prisoners across the Reich. 40 men or 8 horses, whichever suffered less. Instead, they were directed onto Pullman coaches, padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows. Headman Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the France campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. While I climbed aboard and wrote one sentence in his diary, before the train even pulled out of the station, we boarded like tourists, not prisoners. The American guard seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in our car. Air conditioning on a prison transport in August. The prisoners had believed such luxury existed only on Hitler's personal train. The 3-day journey from Norfolk to the camps of Texas and Oklahoma had barely begun, and already the world these men had been trained to understand was coming apart. As the trains rolled south and west through the American night, the prisoners pressed their faces against the glass and witnessed an America that simply could not exist, according to everything they had been told. Every small town blazed with electricity. By Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp displayed. Illuminated shop windows, electric signs, and houses with lights burning in multiple rooms simultaneously. Factory windows glowed through midnight. Parking lots full even at 12 o'clock. Trains passed factories running night shifts, third shifts, in a nation already producing more material than the entire Axis combined. Obergefreiter Müller, whose father was a Nazi party bloc leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered by historians in 1987, We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Every one of them had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guard told us this was normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He shrugged and said we would see. Through Tennessee and Kentucky, the full weight of American industrial power began to bear down on the prisoner's worldview. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river. Its electric furnaces consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the train slowed as it passed the Rubbertown complex, 4 massive synthetic rubber facilities that had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. One American facility complex, 18 months old, producing 6 times what Germany could achieve at full capacity. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben who understood precisely what he was seeing, later recalled, "I knew those plants. I could identify the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers from a moving train window." Each facility was more advanced than anything we had built, and there were 4 of them just in this one location. They told us there were dozens more across the country. I said nothing to the men around me, but I understood immediately what it meant for the war. Outside Detroit, the train passed something that broke a Luftwaffe pilot. The Willow Run plant, a single building, built in 9 months but was visible from miles away. This one factory produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 separate parts manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the glass and began counting. He could see 17 B-24s in various stages of completion from the train window. He had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat. He wrote, "I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible. I stopped believing in German air superiority somewhere over the state of Kentucky. It was not the scale that broke the German soldiers most profoundly. It was the waste." At a railway stop in Virginia, Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, began calculating. He had spent his entire career managing industrial scarcity, rationing components, stretching resources, accounting for every kilowatt. Now, watching American railway workers change shifts, he made a calculation that he could not fit inside his existing understanding of the world. The single railway yard they stopped in used more electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin consumed in a day. He recorded exactly 4 words in his diary. The waste was magnificent. Camp Hearn had been built in 4 months on 720 acres near the town of Hearn in Robertson County, Texas. The prisoners had expected barbed wire, concrete, and deprivation. They found wooden barracks with electric lights, not oil lamps, indoor plumbing, flush toilets, hot showers, individual beds with mattresses, sheets, and 2 blankets, a recreation hall with ping-pong tables and musical instruments, a library, and then the camp hospital. Oberst Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical suites, dental chairs, pharmaceutical supplies that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941, and penicillin. the wonder drug that German field hospitals could only dream of, used freely on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs. The Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. Not as propaganda, simply as standard treatment. I wept in the supply room and told no one why. Oberst Dr. Friedrich Bauer. By winter 1943, American intelligence officers had a clinical name for what was happening across the camps: ideological collapse syndrome. The most fanatical Nazis had gone quiet, not because they had been silenced, not because they had been threatened or punished. They had simply seen too much. The production statistics they had once dismissed as American propaganda were not statistics anymore. They were factories visible from a train window. They were parking lots full of workers' cars. They were penicillin administered freely to enemies. Major Paul Newland, an American intelligence officer who monitored the psychological state of prisoners at multiple camps, reported to Washington in December 1943. The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They still maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America. The ideology was not being attacked. It was simply being surrounded by contradicting evidence on every side every day until it could no longer breathe. Lieutenant Hermann Gutsch, captured with the 10th Panzer Division in North Africa, had arrived at Camp Herne as a committed National Socialist. He had served with distinction, believed in the cause, and carried a photograph of his family in Stuttgart alongside a photograph of Hitler in his breast pocket. 6 months later, he wrote a letter that passed American censors. We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals. I am ashamed of how long I believed them. By September 1943, severe labor shortages brought the prisoners out of the camps and into the American heartland. Trucks drove them daily to farms, canneries, and factories, traveling through the heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month. In Nebraska's sugar beet fields, prisoners worked alongside a farmer's son, 16 years old, who drove a tractor worth more than his father had earned in a lifetime. When Lang mentioned this in conversation, the boy laughed and explained that it wasn't even a good tractor. His father was waiting for a new John Deere model that would be better still. At a Campbell Soup factory in New Jersey, Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented what he witnessed. Everything was automated: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers processing hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to the radio and drinking coffee. December 1943. And then something happened that no prisoner was prepared for, something that broke through every remaining defense of Nazi ideology and reached something deeper than politics, something human. American churches, civic groups, and schools sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, to enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. The local Methodist church choir at Camp Herne learned German Christmas carols phonetically and performed them for the prisoners. Women from Herne baked and sent in homemade cookies. Boy Scouts hand-delivered Christmas cards drawn by children. These were people whose sons were fighting German armies across the Atlantic. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the Allied bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies, yet they show us Christian charity. Not propaganda, genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power, only those who do not fear us at all." The Christmas feast at Camp Hearn, documented in precise detail in quartermaster records, included roast turkey, 1 pound per man, ham, candied sweet potatoes, green beans, cornbread stuffing, cranberry sauce, mince pie, apple pie, ice cream, beer for enlisted men, California wine for officers. The meal totaled approximately 5,000 calories per person. German civilian rations that same Christmas, when available, 1,200 calories per day. Feldwebel Hansa could only write one line: "We ate like kings, better than German generals eat, better than party leaders." The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? I could not finish the sentence. The camp theater showed regular Hollywood films, not propaganda, not carefully selected triumphal narratives. Regular American cinema. The prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, a story about American defeat and slow, painful recovery, and found it resonated uncomfortably with their own situation. They watched The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that a nation at war would show its own poverty, its own failures, its own unresolved wounds to its enemies. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote in a letter, "They hide nothing. They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here it is considered patriotic. I do not know what to do with this information." When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, the prisoners experienced what could only be described as their final ideological collapse. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave alone, an artificial harbor, the Mulberry, constructed in the English Channel, a supply system delivering 15,000 tons of material daily across open beaches. Newsreel footage arrived at the camps within days. The prisoners watched it in silence. Hauptfeldwebel Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources. Zero, the mathematics were always against us. We simply refused to see them." The scale of what was happening across America's 500-plus camps can be measured in statistics that remain extraordinary even today. Of 371,683 German prisoners held in the United States, only 2,222 attempted escape. That is 0.6%. Zero successful permanent escapes. No American civilians were harmed by escaped prisoners. By 1944, over 40,000 prisoners were voluntarily enrolled in educational programs, studying English, American history, mathematics, agricultural science, and democratic theory. 25,000 had completed formal democracy courses by war's end. Fewer than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs by May 1945. Yet all post-war surveys conducted by American occupation authorities found that 74% of returned prisoners held favorable views of American democracy. 61% supported Marshall Plan aid when it was announced. 55% advocated for a German-American alliance. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German prisoners in American camps. Many refused to believe it initially. They said it was propaganda, American fabrications to humiliate a defeated people. Then letters arrived from Germany, from their own families, confirming what they had seen. Hetman Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant." Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, bombed, and destitute. Cities reduced to rubble. Currency worthless. A moral catastrophe as profound as the physical one. But they brought something back that could not be bombed. They had seen how a democratic industrial society actually functioned. Not in theory, not in propaganda. They had watched it from train windows and factory floors and farm fields. They knew that reconstruction was possible because they had witnessed a society that had achieved it. A society built not on racial hierarchy and conquest, but on productivity, freedom, and the simple dignity of treating workers well. The results became visible within a decade. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Holstein, who taught classes at a POW camp in Kansas, became the founding president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Weckmar, held at Camp Herne, served as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. Former prisoners occupied 48 seats in the Bundestag. 312 became mayors or city councilors. Nearly 2,000 worked in agricultural modernization. More than 4,000 managed businesses using American industrial methods. Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs, "We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production." These lessons, learned as prisoners, shaped the new Germany. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. 40 years after the war ended, over 500 former German prisoners returned to Texas. They were old men now. Many had grandchildren. Some had become doctors, engineers, diplomats, or farmers. Some had never returned to Germany at all. They had stayed in Minnesota, Nebraska, and California and built lives in the country that had once held them prisoner. They stood in the same Texas light that had first stunned them as young soldiers, and they looked at each other across the decades. Former Obergefreiter Hans Wehr, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to America to become a physician in Georgetown, Maine, addressed the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity. They treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. That was the thing we could not explain and could not forget. And then there is the story of Georg Gardner. Gardner escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico in September 1945. Not because he had been mistreated, not because conditions were harsh. Out of boredom and a growing irresistible curiosity about American life that no prison camp, however comfortable, could fully satisfy. He did not flee to the border. He did not attempt to reach a neutral country. He moved to California. Under the assumed name Dennis Wiles, Georg Gardner spent the next 40 years becoming American. He married an American woman. He raised children. He coached tennis. He made friends, built a life, attended church, paid taxes. He had been German for 25 years and American for 40 when he finally surrendered voluntarily on television in 1985 for a documentary about his extraordinary story. The FBI investigated. He had broken no laws except illegal entry. He received citizenship in 1987. He was asked in the documentary why he had stayed. He thought for a moment. "I chose the better country," he said. "It was not a complicated decision." At the 1985 reunion dinner, Hauptmann Hermann Gutsch, the man who had arrived at Camp Hearn as a committed National Socialist and left as something else entirely, rose to give the keynote address. He was 78 years old. His hands shook slightly as he held his notes. He looked out at the room of old German soldiers and American veterans and said, "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest but from production, not from hatred but from diversity, not from tyranny but from freedom. We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. We saw farmers who fed the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We returned to Germany with a mission to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America from your former enemies, now your friends, thank you for showing us the way." Hauptmann Hermann Gutsch, Reunion, Keynote, Austin, Texas, 1985. The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies, united in the recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. America's secret weapon was not the B-24 Liberator, not the Sherman tank, not the atomic bomb, nor the logistics miracle of the Normandy beaches, nor the endless columns of Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic. It was a Pullman coach with air conditioning. It was a working toilet. It was a Christmas dinner. It was a 16-year-old farmer's son in Nebraska who laughed about his tractor. It was the simple, quiet, overwhelming evidence of what a free society could build, witnessed by its enemies, absorbed by them, and carried home in their hands and memories, and transformed worldviews to become the foundation of a new Europe. The German prisoners did not arrive in America expecting to be educated. They arrived expecting cruelty, or at best, indifference. They encountered something their ideology had no category for, a society so secure in its own abundance that it could afford to be kind to the men who had been trying to kill its sons. And that kindness, that ordinary, daily, unremarkable American kindness, was the most devastating weapon in the entire arsenal of democracy. The trains that carried them into captivity in 1943 bore warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried architects of a better world. They had seen America, and they would never be the same. If this story changed the way you see history, you're not ready for what's coming next. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on your notifications, because the stories they never taught you are just getting started. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or other countries. Tell us in the comment section.